first of all, the title. Some of you may recognise that this is a metaphorical steel. It's been used a lot. It came from E.M. Forster's essay after the Second World War called Two Cheers for Democracy, in his response to Nazism. And I think it's a good metaphor because it allows you to broadly endorse something that you think vaguely is a good idea, like democracy, say, and then say, yeah, but I've got these reservations. These are my sneaking doubts or the reasons I'm not quite sure whether it works sort of position. So that's broadly what I'm going to do with the biopsychosocial model. So to indicate from the beginning, this is a supportive critique. It's not a demolition job. I'm not trying to in any way disrespect its gains, but I am trying to say it's got limitations. Okay, so 3 main aims. Summarize the history of the model. I then want to summarize critical realism as a resource because when I've been looking at the problem of psychiatric knowledge and medical knowledge more generally, both as a psychologist and a sociologist, I've had to actually resort to philosophy as an underlabouring discipline to really try to clarify what the problem is. And critical realism for me has been an important resource. I'm going to share with you why that is an important resource. And for those of you who've never heard of it, I hope to try and explain it. It took me 20 years to understand it, and I've got about 3 minutes to explain it to you. So, fingers crossed. And then as a result of introducing the two, I'll then apply a critical realist analysis to the model itself. So they're the 3 aims. The history of the model is actually quite recent in formal terms. It was actually introduced by a psychiatrist called George Engel in 2 key papers, which I've got there. The second one is probably the most important in terms of its title, because it gives away what the issue is, which is the need for a new medical model, a challenge for biomedicine. So from the beginning, this is where Engel started. Engel was a psychiatrist who was interested in psychosomatics, and initially he took a very bioreductionist, mechanistic, somatic approach to it. He was a physician, and like most doctors, he was socialized to prioritize the body. And these ideas were challenged actually by the influence of his colleagues who were psychoanalysts. So in many ways, this model grew out of a healthy tension between biomedical psychiatry in the United States and psychoanalysis. That's how it emerged as a formal title. However, before this began, and latterly you'll find people who use the biopsychosocial model often allude to general systems theory. Now, general systems theory is a different kettle of fish. It came from biologists in the 19th century, and I'll say a bit more about that afterwards. But probably the most important figure associated with it is somebody with the incredible name of Ludwig von Bertalanffy and his colleague Paul Weiss in Vienna. Those of you who are interested in family therapy, for instance, may already be familiar with ideas of systems ideas. So, I mentioned Engel, I've mentioned psychosomatics and his objection to biological reductionism. He became convinced that actually there was no point in simply hammering away all the time at biological mechanisms. It didn't deliver the goods. Bearing in mind, this is a guy who's mainly interested in respiratory disease as well. He was what we might now call a liaison psychiatrist, actually. And he realized that a direct somatic approach wasn't working. But if you go back in terms of the history of ideas, this tension was around right at the beginning of the 19th century of the emergence of 2 very important currents within medicine and in social science. And these were led by a single figure called Rudolf Virchow. And Rudolf Virchow is credited with being the father of both clinical medicine, as we know it today, and also social medicine. In many ways, medical sociology, when people write about the history of medical sociology, they attribute their own roots to Rudolf Virchow, again, a physician. So he was big cheese, a big honcho. He was important. And he developed the beginnings of what he called a biosocial model. The idea that it was impossible to understand biological mechanisms without reference to social determinants which impacted upon them. To explain, for instance, why there were variations in immunity to disease. Why is it that in certain populations, when there's a contagion, some people get the disease, some don't, some survive, some die quickly, or whatever. So this is really fascinating for infectious diseases in the 19th century. Bearing in mind that infectious diseases were the dominant preoccupation, understandably, for the 19th century. Because if you had 12 children, probably 10 of them would die before they were 2. Okay, so it was understandable that when people died of infectious diseases, it became a preoccupation of medicine. So the next point raises an interesting spectre, which was all the research that was done on infectious diseases by Pasteur, Klebs, Semmelweis's work on obstetric wards, finding out why certain women on obstetric wards died of infections, for instance. These people together who studied infectious diseases began to introduce something very seductive for the medical profession, which was the germ theory. This gave confidence to the idea that if we were to understand anything wrong with you, it was probably a single agent coming from the environment, infecting the body, and then leading to an outcome. So you got a straightforward linear pattern of etiology, diagnosis, prognosis, and then you survived or you didn't. This was important. Who's to deny this is important? Okay. By the end of the 19th century, then, the internal preoccupations of medicine meant that Virchow's original ideas about social medicine were pushed further and further into the background. And the dominant ideas of somatic determination, derived from Pasteur et al., started to dominate clinical medicine. So by the beginning of the 20th century, we had a medical profession who couldn't think outside of the body. Their whole socialization was based upon somatic preoccupations, and this was the challenge of biological reductionism, which I'm going to come back to. Alongside that, though, we've got this other interesting development, which is the work of 2 biologists, experimental biologists, von Bertalanffy and Weiss, in Vienna, and they began to realize that experimentalism within biology, within the laboratory, was actually very limited. Because what was the point in having controlled experiments when they went into a field, say they were studying plants, actually all those variables plus several other variables were operating. And they talked to horticulturists, and if you listen to gardeners' question time, they think in open systems terms, which is they will dig around, if you pardon the pun, about the way in which a particular garden, whether it's south-facing or it's this soil or that soil, why do some plants grow and some don't? There's no point studying plants in the laboratory without reference to actually horticulture, to the way that the natural environment works. And it was the work of these biologists that began to question experimentalism. And they began to introduce the idea that you can study things in closed or isolated systems, but actually living organisms exist in a context in which they adapt to or die. This was the beginnings of open systems reasoning. And thereafter, we got a tradition within social science, and in medical science to some extent, of the idea that all living organisms exist in open systems, and certainly within the human sciences, you cannot study human beings without reference to open systems. It's impossible. This is another reason why, by the way, why experimental psychology is also limited, inevitably limited, for exactly the same reason. Okay. Mayer and psychobiology. Adolf Mayer, Swiss psychiatrist, moved to Baltimore, an important figure because he was the first person, Adolf Mayer, that said, why is this patient presenting with this particular problem at this particular time in their life? And if you went to the session earlier this morning, we were revisiting in a more elaborated way basically the questions that Adolf Mayer raised. And noticeably, he was a psychiatrist, he introduced the notion of psychobiology. Which I suppose begs the question, where is the social? But Mayer's idea was, if you listen to a patient's account and you took a detailed history about the meanings they attached to their behaviour, the relationships that were important to them in their life, what had happened to them, you might be able to build up a picture of why they are where they are now. and they weren't there last year, and why they and not their brother or sister, for instance, has this problem. This was Mayer. Quite a sophisticated idea, very influential, by the way, in academic psychiatry in the first half of the 20th century. If you look at people like Aubrey Lewis at the Institute of Psychiatry, he was a Mayerian. So this approach was actually very, very popular before the so-called biological revolution of the 1950s, when we got the introduction of the impact of the drug companies. Before that, there was a lot of open-mindedness, and this is the emergence of social psychiatry. Okay. So that's something about the background to it. The key references, by the way, I want to now draw attention to are the basis of the rest of the paper. So a more elaborate version of this paper is in the Journal of Critical Realism, which I wrote, and it was a response to a tradition within critical realism, including by its own leader and guru, Roy Bhaskar, who worked on disability studies in Scandinavia with Denmark, and they relied very heavily on the taken for granted legitimacy of the biopsychosocial model. And so my paper is a response, a critical response to their paper, querying whether actually critical realists should rely too naively on the model. Again, not saying the model was wrong, but just saying this is what's wrong with it. And this is what I'm going to now tell you a bit more about. First of all, I have to explain critical realism. Okay. It's a philosophy developed by Roy Bhaskar. Bhaskar was an Oxford philosopher. His PhD supervisor was Rom Harre, some of you may have heard of. He was a Marxist. He considered that the traditions of Western empiricism were faulty. He considered, however, that many of the ideas from continental philosophy, which were preoccupied with idealism, also had their problems. And so he tried to develop a philosophy which underlabored for both social science and natural science. He brought them together in a concept called critical realism as a philosophy. He considered that the role of philosophy was to underlabor. This is a term he took from John Locke. The role of philosophers is to get rid of the rubbish, the conceptual rubbish that underpins disciplines. Because disciplines, for their own sweet reasons, tend to take things for granted. They just take it, doctors take it for granted that bodies are important, psychologists take it for granted that individuals are important. It doesn't matter what you take for granted. But the point he's getting at is that philosophers can sort of say, why are you doing that? Why are you taking those things for granted? Okay. So the philosophy, it's a bit like a milking stool. It relies on three important legs, and they're all important. They're all important because they're interdependent. If you take one leg away, you'll fall off the stool. Okay, they're all three are important. The first is ontological realism. And this is the idea that reality exists, it's mind independent, and it's constituted by different layers and depths. The empirical, what I can see ahead of me now, you guys. The actual, which is downstairs, another set of events happening, but I can't see them. So there's the actual going on right now, all over the world, but we can only see a little bit of it. So the empirical is only a limited bit of the actual. And then beyond the actual, there are a set of powers and mechanisms which may or may not operate. So an example would be a bulb under the ground you can't see. It's not a flower, but it's a flower in potentia. Okay? A jet plane in a hangar can fly, but it's stationary. So powers and mechanisms exist, and they're real, but they may not be actualized. They're just there as part of reality. Okay, is that clear? So that's the reality bit. Okay, this chimes very much with common sense. It makes sense to most people, this. It's only social scientists and some philosophers who query this, but by and large, this is in tune with common sense. But this is important. He also said that the way we represent reality, the language we use, the meanings we attribute, the discourses we use are also important, because as human beings, we are language bearers. And we attach meanings to reality in different ways across different time and space, both individually and collectively. So, for example, the work of George Kelly about the construct system, which changes over time. So I don't see the world now as I did 20 years ago. Things have changed in my life, okay? My way of construing the world has changed. But also collectively, we see the world in certain ways. And when we do it collectively, it's called ideology. We have a collective set of beliefs, or Aristotle called it doxa, a set of assumptions within a particular culture or subculture. So Basco said, what complicates reality is that we also represent reality as well. You've got to bear both in mind at the same time. And then the third point is, at the end of all that, you've then got to say, well, what's true? Given the fact that this is an open system in flux, where there are these changes in meaning across time and space, how do you know whether something's true? Did 6 million Jews die in the concentration camp? Or is it just a social construction? Basco would say the error of epistemological relativism without realism is that you can construct an argument that says it's just a perspective that 6 million Jews died in the concentration camp. He says, no, that's wrong. 6 million people died. This is true. This is reality. But at the same time, you will have a different perspective on the meaning of that, of the Holocaust. You know, is it the most important genocide in history? You can argue about that, but the point is you've got to do both together. But judgmental rationalism is saying you must come to rational judgment and have a hazard provisionally at what you believe to be true. Now, truth has become a dirty word. And actually, although we talk about a post-truth society in relation to Trump, I do think that social science itself has been responsible for this, particularly in relation to the linguistic turn in the 1980s. And I think there are many social scientists who have been guilty of this problem, of being over-preoccupied with the second point, and making a casualty of the first point. So the difference between a critical realist and a social constructionist, or a radical social constructionist, is that critical realists adopt judgmental rationalism, not judgmental relativism. Any story will not do. Some stories are truer than others, and we just have to have a shot at that, have a go at it. Okay. So it can critique naive realism on one side. It argues, critical realism says that the tradition of positivism, what Basco called naive realism, is just faulty. It's reliant too much on surface descriptions. It gives the idea that reality is limited to only what we can see and prove, when actually reality is much more complex, much deeper, often unknowable, by the way. Much of reality we will never know. But Basco said axiomatically, it's still there. Life is difficult, complex, multi-layered, often unknowable. And that can be overwhelming to actually think about. It's a bit like thinking about eternity. But he said that's what you've got to try and hang on to. So he can criticize that. Basco's ideas came from a Greek philosopher called Heraclitus, who said, a man cannot step into the same river twice. I don't know if people have ever heard that expression. It's the idea, the river is often used in pop songs to symbolize life, hence Bruce Springsteen and others. But it's also used often by philosophers. The river somehow is a good symbol because it's complex, it flows, it ebbs and flows, it's got multiple currents, it's got different depths. So it's a really good metaphor for life, the river. And Heraclitus said, a man cannot step into the same river twice. But he did say the river has a bed. It has a structure. Okay? So life is both changing, in flux, but it's got broad determinants surrounding it as well, because the river has a course. But it also criticizes idealism on the other side. I say everything's not merely socially constructed. This is faulty reasoning to say that things are merely socially constructed. Our understanding can be naive about or ignore reality on one side or meanings on the other. And actually the trick, and it's not always easy, is you've got to do both. You've got to address causes and meanings. You've got to blend them in some way or other and then have your shot at saying, I think this is probably now what we should say is the case. That's the truth claim. Now, so the BPS model, where does that leave it, the biopsychosocial model? My argument is that the biopsychosocial model is strong on ontology. It's quite good at causes, actually. It's not bad. It does encourage you, if you take it seriously, to take into account biological, psychological, and social factors. But it's absolutely naive about epistemology. And this, I think, is really what I want to dwell on, the main problem, which is about epistemology, because it fails to address medical and pharmaceutical ideologies and interests, which I'll say a bit about now. There are three major problems about being naive about medical knowledge. Firstly, lay knowledge or personal meanings may or may not be compatible with medical knowledge. What is the point in being clever as a doctor if your patients just have no sympathy for what you're saying to them? They just understand their problem in a completely different way. We've all had encounters, even with our own GPs, I suspect, at times, where we've gone in, we've sort of got an idea what we think is the problem, and the GP tries to disabuse us, and we come out dissatisfied. That could be an example. So there is a problem anyway, fundamentally, that we don't know whether lay knowledge and medical knowledge are compatible. We've got to find that out. That's an empirical question, actually. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. Secondly, medical knowledge may transmit interests other than the patient's. We assume that medicine is a altruistic, a social enterprise which is orientated towards the amelioration or cure of illness. But actually, it transmits all sorts of other interests. Its own interests, for a start. Medical dominance is preoccupied with controlling patients, controlling those around them, including other staff. So there's a whole tradition within medical sociology which describes the process of medical dominance, and knowledge is often used for that purpose. So the doctor says, I'm the only one here who can diagnose this problem. I'm only the one here skilled to do X. And that produces a power relationship with those around them. But in addition, it transmits the interests of the drug companies, because diagnostic categories and medical practice are bound up with the pharmaceutical industry. And finally, the clinical gaze, or the insight of the doctor, the physician looking inwards, it means you can only look in one direction. It obscures what David Smale called outsight. It's not good enough just to actually keep looking at patients. You've got to look in the other direction, which includes you and the patient, your shared context. Okay, that's what David Smale called a social outsight. The third point is that illness always reflects deviancy. In a I think still a very useful book, which is Peter Sedgwick's book called Psychopolitics, which came out in 1980 now, he made this point when he was discussing anti-psychiatry. He said that all illness reflects deviancy, because all illness is about social expectations of how we should or should not be, how we should or should not act, how competent we should be, whether we're able to do X, Y, or Z. It's not just mental illness. It's a more generic question, this, about norms. And again, this may obscure outsight. If we get preoccupied with the patient's behavior, we may think, well, what about the norms? Maybe we need to look at the norms as well. And the BPS model doesn't do that. So I'm going to give you some examples now. Many of you here will know about these, but I'm going to repeat those for those who are not. And I'm going to use them to illustrate two important concepts for critical realism, which are the epistemic and ontic fallacies. I'll explain what they are as we go along. The first is the problem of functional psychiatric diagnoses. And these are, as we know, most of us here, they're pretty pathetic. They generally have, by definition, have no etiological specificity. That's why they're functional disorders. That's why they're called functional disorders. The possible exception, and this is a debatable point, is whether PTSD is. Is it the only functional disorder in which, under, say, DSM or ICD, people specify the cause? Question mark, 2,000 words. Okay, so PTSD maybe is an exception. I don't know. Poor treatment specificity. The drugs used to treat one set of conditions are used in another. They're completely promiscuous psychiatrists in the way they dish out drugs experimentally, this, that, and the other. And GPs are the same. People come in with an anxiety problem. Well, give them low-dose antidepressants because they're an anxiolytic. So we get this sort of diffusion effect of medication. There's no specificity in mental health problems. And we know they've got poor concept and poor predictive validity. We know that they've got poor inter-rater reliability, test-retest reliability. Actually, the early studies done on DSM-5 now are actually, I think, are even worse than some of the data that came out on DSM-4 in terms of these criteria. Just in terms of reliability, bearing in mind that reliability is not validity. So that's the next problem. And then finally, and this is the one that we often forget, a good medical diagnosis should be helpful to the patient. It sounds very obvious that, but why do we forget it? You know, why don't we just ask people, well, what did you think about being diagnosed? You know, was it helpful? And by the way, about 10% of psychiatric patients do find diagnosis helpful. It's not wholesale rejection. We were talking earlier as well about the problematic diagnosis of autism, which is another example where there may be reasons why people actually find a diagnosis useful. But the point is, again, it's an empirical question. We need to ask this. And generally, most psychiatric patients do not find a label of a mental illness or a mental disorder helpful. The majority do not find it helpful. They're either neutral about it, or they want to express hostility about it, they hate the stigma, or they want to put in another account, which is maybe psychological or spiritual. They have any number of alternative accounts as lay people to the medical dominant form. So, what are the errors here? Two errors. The epistemic fallacy, which is confusing the map with the territory. We tend to confuse the idea that we call something something, and then we think that's it. Well, actually not. All you're doing is giving it a name, what you consider a name that's important, but it may not fit the territory. You know, it may or may not be like the territory. Some maps are good, some are bad. You've got to understand that relationship between what you're looking at and what you're labelling. And that's called the epistemic fallacy. The map is not the territory. A diagnosis of schizophrenia is not useful because it's a poor concept. And so, you know, I say to a psychiatrist, schizophrenia doesn't exist, and he says, no, you're stupid. I said, okay, I'm stupid. And I said, why am I stupid? He said, well, I'll show you somebody with schizophrenia. So he takes me to the ward, and I say, no, that's somebody you've diagnosed with schizophrenia. They haven't got anything. They've just got your diagnosis. And they look at me as if I'm stupid. So anyway, the point I'm getting at is if you're inside the epistemic fallacy, you don't get it. You lack insight. You lack insight into what you're doing. The second one is the ontic fallacy, which is closely related, but this is when something is self-evidently true. Good example, you're going to your GP, you've lost interest in life, you can't work very well, your sex life's rubbish, you can't sleep, and the GP says, it's okay. You've got low serotonin, you've got a brain disorder, and I'm going to give you these pills, which will make it better. The GP may really believe that this person has got a brain disorder. They believe it. That's called the ontic fallacy. To the GP, they look at somebody, they say, they've got a brain disorder, which is to do with a fluctuation about serotonin in their brain. So these are closely related problems, and we get it with contested diagnosis, particularly in psychiatry. But we can broaden this out. And the second example I want to give you is the problem of medicalisation. This was a list. Can you read that? Okay. Can you read it at the back? Yeah. This was a list of 20 non-diseases that were identified by the readership of the British Medical Journal in 2000. So they did a survey of all their readership and asked them, can you tell us what you consider to be the top 20 non-diseases? And then they added them up, I suppose. I don't know what they did. Anyway, they came up with this list of 20 non-diseases. And they're quite, well, I don't know how you're going to react to these. Aging, work, boredom, bags under the eyes, ignorance, baldness, freckles, big ears, grey or white hair, ugliness, childbirth, allergy to the 21st century. I've got that one. Jet lag, unhappiness, cellulite. I didn't know what that was, but I do now. Hangover, anxiety about penis size or penis envy, no comment. Pregnancy, no comment. Road rage and loneliness. Now, okay, it's a bit of a funny list, but when you then look at it again, you find something interesting, which actually a good quota of those have already been colonised by medicine. So although the general readership said that there were non-diseases, actually the medical profession, A, and B, the pharmaceutical industry are heavily involved already in responding to these 20 top non-diseases, including cellulite. Apparently you can buy stuff in a chemist for cellulite. I didn't know that, but you can. And you could argue that, I don't know, road rage, loneliness are the bread and butter of counsellors or psychological therapists, or that, you know, bags under the eyes and I don't know where else. Big ears. Freckles even. Can you have your freckles removed? I don't know. So this is the mainstream work of cosmetic surgeons. And so we're gone. So the point I'm getting at here is that what initially appears to be a straightforward no-brainer, that you can understand why they've said these things, you see the power of medical knowledge pressing down all the time on variations in human life, which are largely physical. Some of those are behavioural, but many of them are physical, they're not behavioural. Any variation, any difference can potentially be medicalised. Okay. So, what's my conclusion? The biopsychosocial model is very, very strong on causation, on ontology. It gives us a good feel for how things emerge, come into reality. And I think we should take it seriously. I think we should take into consideration that actually there are biological factors, that we may have, for instance, a genetic proneness to breast cancer. Why not take that evidence seriously? You'd be stupid not to take that evidence seriously. And so encouraging us to increasingly be elaborate about all levels of reality, the biological, the psychological, and the social, is absolutely fine. The danger has been under the jurisdiction of medicine that if you do a literature search on the biopsychosocial model written by doctors, it tends to default back to bioreductionism. John wrote a paper, when was it? 2002? About 10 years ago, over 10 years ago, for the psychologists called the bio model, didn't you? Which he was emphasising this point, the tendency to use the biopsychosocial model as a form of rhetoric, particularly within the medical profession. But actually, when you get close to what they're actually doing, they do fall back, because the doctors, they will fall back on somatic explanations. It's their natural default position. Caution there, though, of course, is that psychologists also fall back on psychological levels. And one of the big stress tests for the work that Lucy Mary et al. Explained this morning is actually to say to psychologists, you've got to get beyond being a psychologist. There are other disciplines that actually might inform what you're doing. Sociology, economics, history, philosophy, Psychology hasn't got all the answers. It's supplying an important pathway into understanding the interface of the individual and society. But if you only get stuck with psychology, you will end up with CBT for psychosis. That's what you'll end up with. You'll end up with some sort of technocentric approach, which is very self-confident, which is the equivalent of doctors giving drugs for specific conditions, and you'll have no insight at all to what's going on in terms of the wider context. So I don't think this vulnerability is only for doctors. I think psychologists have this vulnerability as well, by the way, of reductionism. But in our case, it's psychological reductionism. And so it's okay on that side, but it's not very good as a reflexive theory. And bearing in mind, to give George Engel his due, he never said it was a theory. He only ever called it a model. I don't know if you're any mathematicians here, but mathematicians talk about a model being something which is of relevance to a relatively narrow range of phenomena to account for them. A theory is something much bigger. It's a wider framework of understanding. And that's why, for instance, I've got much more confidence in general systems theory as a theory than I have in the biopsychosocial model, because I think it's more sophisticated. It encourages you to think in a much wider way about open systems. And many people adopting the BPS model have relied on general systems theory. And so I think it can be augmented. But we do need to understand open systems in flux over time and place. This morning, those people who came to the session about the new post-diagnostic world we hope to enter, it was very important to say there are demi-regularities in life. There are recurring things about being a human being. Last night, Richard Bentel was talking about we all need 150 relationships based upon primatology. He's probably right, that. So there are regularities. Basco called them demi-regularities. But you've always got to remember the demi, that at a different time and space, different time and place, things will be different. The causal factors will be different. The meanings attributed will be different. And so that is really important. And the problem about understanding flux, because Heraclitus, in his river metaphor, was competing with a different form of philosophy, which came from Parmenides. Parmenides said, the world is given and it's fixed by the gods. And you then got to sort of understand it as a fixed set of relationships. That's positivism. So today I haven't been using critical reason to attack positivism, but you could turn it in the other direction and say there's a real fault with that problem, which is the traditional biomedical model, that they're looking for universal disease categories which will exist in perpetuity in all conditions and apply to all people. which is nonsensical. But that's what they do. But that is an example of medical positivism, and critical realists would be equally critical of that. Okay. So, I just want to finish on this note that it was only ever introduced to reform the medical model. Do you remember, that's why I drew attention at the beginning to say this is a new medical model. It was never intended as a critical point of reflexivity for the medical profession, because if it was, it would have failed, actually. So it's got its merits, but it's also got the severe limitations that I've tried to outline for you. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.